Hey, David Brewster here with a new episode of Chordplay, and this is Implied Chords from Blues to Van Halen. And I've had this idea on my list of lessons and material for over 5 years, like the whole time I've had my channel. I'm not really sure why it's taken me this long to finally put this episode together. This is very important and eye-opening, but it's also kind of elusive and confusing for a lot of people that haven't seen this before. And that's implied chords, or partial chords. And some of the viewers out there might be surprised to learn that when you're playing chords and writing songs, you don't have to play full chords. Now, there are times when you might need to, like if you're a solo guitarist or part of like a duo, like maybe an acoustic duo or something, where two guitars are just kind of filling up everything. In those situations, you might want to play giant, 5 or 6 string chords. But if you play in a band, like with another guitarist, a bassist, maybe a keyboardist in the mix, you definitely want to kind of scale back or kind of trim back your chords and start playing implied partial chords, which is what this lesson is going to basically tackle. And we're going to look at some ideas from blues and funk and rock, and then eventually end up in some Van Halen territory. So without further ado, here we go. So to get started here, I'm going to basically recreate something that happened at AIM, at the Atlanta Institute of Music, when I was a student. And I can't faithfully recreate this because you're not sitting here and you can't raise your hand. But I was in music theory class, Randy Hoexter's theory class, and Randy's definitely a great instructor. Taught theory and jazz performance and stuff at the school. He's still in the Atlanta area, but I don't think he's teaching at AIM anymore. But Randy's a monster, definitely a music theory beast and a keyboard wizard. But Randy was teaching the class, mostly guitarists in the class. There might have been a bassist and a couple drummers in the mix, but it was mainly guitarists. Randy came in and he asked us a very simple question. He was like, okay, a 4-note chord. What are the 2 most important notes of a 4-note chord? In the entire class, we raised our hands. He called on somebody, and the student he called on said the root and the 5th. And Randy said, wrong. And then he asked the question again, what's the 2 most important notes of a 4-note chord? Nobody raised their hands. I remember sitting there thinking the root and the 5th aren't important. That was my whole world at that time, power chords. But then he explained it's the 3rd and the 7th. And the 3rd and the 7th dictate a lot more than the root and the 5th. The 3rd basically defines if the chord's major or minor. And then the 7th basically, defines the chord either major 7th or dominant, flat 7. And that includes dominant 7th chords and also minor 7 chords too. But, and also minor 7 flat 5 technically. But that was eye-opening to realize like the 3rd and the 7th are actually more important than the root and the 5th. So going back to what I was talking about, like in a band situation, if your bass player is playing the root note, let's say G, you don't technically have to play that G root note. The bass player is already playing it. If there's a keyboardist and they're playing G, then that root note is already provided. And that kind of frees you up to start playing some of these implied partial chords. So let's dig a little bit deeper here. To get started here, we're going to basically start with blues. I think that's probably the easiest place or the easiest style to notice these implied partial chords and implied progressions and stuff. And if you're writing a blues song or playing a blues song, you may notice that it's really rare to see these big giant, bar chords, right? That fills up way too much space, big giant chords like that. So if you're playing with a band with another guitarist, a bassist, and a keyboardist, you don't want to play a big G7 like that. I mean, there are situations and times where maybe you do want to play that big chord, but like in an ensemble, group setting, that's going to hog so much sonic space with that big 6-string chord, right? So to get started here, we're going to basically just investigate, targeting what I was talking about earlier that came from Randy when I was a student at AIM. And that's just targeting the 3rd and the 7th. And we're just going to look at a 1-4-5 progression. But instead of playing these big giant, G7 and C7 and D7, instead of playing these big giant chords like that, we're just going to play 2 notes. But it's not the root and the 5th like a power chord. It's basically the flat 7 and the 3rd. So for G7, think of that chord. But we're just going to target this, that F note and that B note. And that functions as G7 right there. So the first time I saw this demonstrated, it blew my mind. So there's G7, right? Now check out what happens when it moves to the 4 chord, C7. Now all you have to do is just move that shape back 1 fret, and there's an implied C7. You know, that E and that B flat. So that's the major third and the flat 7 of C, which uses the same shape that we had for G7, which that was the flat 7 and the third, but it kind of flips when you move it back like that. Because here we had the flat 7 on bottom, and there the flat 7's on top, right? But it's just 2 notes. There's G7, C7, back to G7. Now guess what happens for D7, the 5 chord? Just take that, move it up 1 fret, and there's your 2 notes of D7 right there. Right? Go back to C7, and then there's G7. So I literally just played 2 notes on the D and the G string. And I basically targeted that implied chord progression. G7, C7, G7 to D7. So to really give you an earful of what we're doing here with these little 2-note chord fragments, I've got the MXR clone looper, and I've basically, you know, laid down this kind of busy, walking, like bluesy bass line. So that's going to basically represent what, say, the bass player is going to play. And if your bass player is walking around like that, grabbing the roots and kind of dancing around, you know, in G7, C7, and D7, then you may want to scale back and do something like this. It's really simple. I'm just going to use those 3 shapes like this. So here's C7, right? Back to G7, D7, C7, G7, and then there's D7 at the end, right? So I just used, you know, those 3 shapes for G7, C7, and D7. So check this out. We're going to move to a different set of strings, but do the exact same thing. And this is definitely going to kind of skirt us toward funk, because you could find funk guitarists, you know, using those shapes, but more often than not, funk guitarists normally put it way up on the top, right? And we can basically do the same thing. You know, here we had F and B. Well, what happens if we grab that B, but then grab this F? Right? The same thing, but flipped, right? Because there's your major third, there's your flat 7, that F, you know, of G. So now we got that little shape. And that's going to function as G7. Now guess what happens when it goes to C? Just move back a fret. And there's a little piece of C7. Now it's the flat 7 and the third, right? So it's once again kind of flipped like we had with this. The same thing's happening right there. So there's G7. Let me play with the bass line. You can kind of hear that. There's G7, there's C7, and then that D7 up there. The same idea, but just a different, you know, kind of voicing for that chord. Basic stuff. Now take those shapes and we're going to basically rework that or recycle it again. Let's take that, let's move it way up here. Alright, so now we've got a flat 7 and the major third of G right there. But now we're going to basically use that same thing, but up here. And once again, that kind of, you know, strange rearrangement of those notes, but there's the flat 7 and the third of G. Then we move that down a fret. You know, there's basically the third and the flat 7 of C, the third and the flat 7 of D. So I hope you can see what we're doing here, but here's the same thing we did here, but reworked and rearranged right here. actually do the same thing with these shapes, right? We could take those and move those up the fretboard. Now we're going to basically approach G7, but we're getting rid of that root note and we're just playing that, the major third and that flat 7 once again. You know, kind of mirroring what we did down here, just like we did, you know, this stuff. But now we're rearranging it right there. What this is doing is it's basically freeing up space. It's giving the bassist more room to play around. And if you start comping chords like that, it's going to give another, you know, instrumentalist, like maybe another guitarist or a keyboardist or a horn player or a vocalist, it's going to give them tons of space and room to play around. So keep in mind that was kind of a blues demonstration, but if you funk up those little chord fragments, it definitely starts sounding more like funk, like this. So it's all about the way you play this stuff. You know, if you started adding a bunch of distortion and rocking out, you could turn it into like a blues rock. But I just wanted to kind of demonstrate that to show you, like, it's all about, you know, the style that you kind of put it in. If it's blues, you might just want to comp those basic strums. If it's funk, you might get a little busier with your strumming and your rhythms. So what about rock music? Definitely rock is directly influenced and inspired from blues, and there's elements of blues that directly appear in rock. But to kind of shift gears here a little bit and get away from just these little two-note, you know, implied partial chords, I decided to kind of shift gears and move into this. So there's lots of rock, you know, songs and guitarists that have kind of used these droned riffs, you know, where basically either they're pedaling a string or maybe the bass player, you know, think Van Halen with Michael Anthony, you know, playing root notes a lot and just pedaling root notes, and then the chords above it kind of change. Piano players do this a lot. They'll sustain root notes and then change chords, you know, with their right hand. But let's just move into A for this. So think of A, you know, like A major right there, right? A. And all I'm going to do is just going to basically walk up using this, you know, one finger bar, and it's going to have a whole series of implied chords. And then we're going to end with A up on the top with that kind of 70s chord inversion, like this. Time, they're really basic, but just by playing that, you might be hearing rock songs just by hitting this. You know, maybe it could be The Who, it could be Van Halen or Zeppelin or somebody, but you can hear, like, just by playing through those chords, you can hear these different shades and moods of different rock songs. That's basic, but it's also really eye-opening, and we're going to relate all these chords to A, because I'm just hearing that root note, you know, played over, like maybe the bass is playing that or another guitarist or something. But start with A major right there. Take that, move it up a whole step. Now some players might want to think of that as a B over A, which it is. But for our purposes here, I want to think of that as an A6 sus2 sharp 11. There's your 6, there's your 2, and there's your sharp 11, related to A, right? So there's A6 sus2 sharp 11, move that up a fret, that's just A minor 7 right there. Take that, move it up a whole step, now it's an A6 sus4. Take that, move it up a whole step there on the 9th fret. Now that's an A major 7 sus2 up there. And then if we basically, you know, hang right there and then add that 70s, you know, chord inversion right there, which we've talked about that a lot on this channel in different episodes. But then we're going to end with A right there, like this. common stuff. Now let's flip that, and now we're going to move to E, just to kind of flesh this out another key. Now here's E major down here, right? Just those bottom strings. And this is going to follow the same path that A had. Take that, move it up a whole step. Now that's E6, sus2, sharp 11, like that. Just like the A, but now we're in E, right? Take that, move it up a half step. Now that's just, E minor 7 right there. Take that, move it up a whole step. Now it's an E6, sus4. Take that, move it up a whole step. Now it's an E major 7, sus2. And then right there, I just basically flipped it to E5, like that. Very similar to what we saw in A. But now in E. So there were some examples of implied chords occurring in rock, so now it's a great time to shift gears and take a look at some Eddie Van Halen examples. Definitely legendary late great, master, and definitely Eddie was a master of these implied chords and partial chords and kind of implying like modal tonalities and stuff in their music. Anytime you're listening to Van Halen and you hear this noticeable shift where it doesn't sound like basic power chords or open position chords, and you hear this kind of strange thing happening, more than likely it's something based around this. And it was really eye-opening for me to notice what Michael Anthony played on a lot of those famous songs. And for years and years, if not decades, I only focused on Eddie's parts. But then I remember looking through guitar magazines that had bass transcriptions, and I looked at some of Michael's parts, and it really opened my eyes, because there was a lot of root notes, a lot of, like steady eighth note lines and stuff. Really simple stuff. But it definitely gave Eddie like this tonality playground, where Michael might have just been playing like an open A or an open E, and then Eddie would dance on top of that root note and imply all sorts of chords. So for this, let's basically borrow some of the moves that we just looked at, before, but let's start, with that A major up there, and we're going to basically go back like this. A lot of chords you can see in there. Actually, a lot of songs you can see hiding in there. Definitely Crazy Train's kind of hiding in there too. But that series of chords, I'm basically using that A root note. But to kind of mimic Van Halen, here I've looped just an open A on bass, just to really kind of give you kind of a sample of what's going on here. So we're starting with A. Bunch of A, implied chords. A major. Some of these we've already looked at. There's A major 7 sus2 right there. Move that back a whole step. Now it's an A6 sus4. From there I moved to just A major right here. Then I flip to that, and that's going to be an A major 7 sus2 implied. And then move this back. Now that's an A6 sus4 implied. And then just end on that A. So once again, those are all implied chords. That open, bass note, was dictating those are all related to A. And then just kind of weaving through those chords. You have a lot of different, chord sounds and tonalities floating around right there. Okay, last but not least, we're going to do a variation of what we just looked at in A, but now we're going to move it to the key of E and introduce some different chords, but this is definitely still in the Van Halen style. So now I'm playing with this. Right. All played against E right there, and I'm actually starting with the Van Halen improved, E sus4 up there. Right, but I'm just doing that. E sus4 to E major, and then take that, move it down a whole step. That's going to be an implied E minor 11 right now, played over that E root note, and then that's going to move to an E9 sus4 implied with just that 7th fret bar, right? that down again. Now we're going to play this. And that's going to be an E minor flat 6 flat 9 implied. Then take that F off, right? And that's just an E minor flat 6. And then right there I move to the 4th fret, against that E root note, and that's an E major 7 sus2, and then I just ended with that E, kind of 70s inversion right there. Right? Definitely kind of Van Halen-isms, popping out right there. So here's that same series of chords played over a looped, E root note played on bass, and I'm using the MXR clone looper again. But this definitely kind of uncovers this Van Halen kind of secret territory, like this. Really simple stuff. But that is eye-opening to kind of hear what those chords sound like, and Eddie did this all the time, where he'd kind of blur between major, family chords and minor family chords, usually just by moving his finger or adding a note or removing a note. And like I mentioned earlier, if you really investigate some of those, transcriptions as far as what Michael played, it always confused me, but then I realized, like, oh, Michael's actually playing, like the root or whatever, Eddie's dancing around on top somewhere. And that definitely eluded me and confused me until I basically compared the two. Compared what Eddie played, and then noticed what Michael played, behind it or below it. And that definitely kind of gave me like the big picture as far as at least Van Halen's universe for sure. Alright, that's going to wrap this episode of Chordplay with this look at implied chords from Blues to Van Halen. And this is really just the tip of the iceberg. I'm literally just opening a door and showing you what's beyond that door. It's up to you to kind of walk through that threshold and explore what's on the other side. And there's a lot. Trust me, by the time you get to jazz and fusion, things get really crazy as far as implied chords. Jazz guitarists are masters of doing this, scaling everything back to just the essential, parts of the chord, different components, the 3rd and the 7th, throwing in 9ths or 6ths or whatever, and sharp 11s and stuff. But it's one of those things that until somebody breaks it down and kind of demonstrates this, you may not really understand what's going on, or you might look at a transcription and think, well, why did the guitarist play that instead of this? Or, I thought those were power chords, but those aren't power chords, or, whatever it is. Usually in a transcription, you'll see this kind of pop out of the pages, like, oh, I didn't realize that's what was going on. But if you're just listening to it, you might miss some of this stuff. Or you might hear it and think, well, what's going on there? The bass player is playing a different note than the guitarist and stuff. And a lot of this is in this implied kind of universe with these implied chords. So anyway, leave some feedback and comments. Please subscribe to Layout Lessons, and I'll be back before you know with more content and material. Thank you.